There we go. Thank you. So let me ask, first of all, is everybody in here comfortable with the English language? Is there anyone who's not comfortable with English? No? That's the good thing about lecturing in front of a bunch of geeks. Everyone speaks English. Hi, my name is Doru. I work as creative supervisor for Ubisoft Blue Byte. I'm actually here to talk to you about something that I call the tiered pyramid method. It's about making better games for less money. It's about games design, and to kind of give you guys a little bit of a background, this is my phone. I don't play a lot of games on it. It's not important. Game design doesn't really care that much about platforms, and I think this stuff is going to apply to you as well. Before I move on then, let me first start by saying I have a lot of text on my slides, and that's mostly because I'm not really that smart, and I forget stuff. So the point is to try to make sure that I don't forget anything by putting a lot of text on there. And then if you get your hands on the slides later, you'll be able to read all the way through it. My boss, who's here in the front row, actually he made a joke about me trying to win like a Guinness record in speed reading. That's definitely not the point. What is true, however, is my original time boxing that I had in mind when I made these presentations, or these slides, should I say, that was kind of a 1 hour thing. So I might skip a few slides here and there that are kind of secondary to the whole thing, and then we'll see what happens in the Q&A section. I might actually return to them later. So, moving on then. About me, first of all. Why should you listen to me? Let me first start by saying that I am, as you can tell by the name, I'm not typically German. You could probably tell by the accent also. I am a Romanian-born person who went to Sweden at the age of 4, and if anyone asks me, I actually identify as Swedish. At age 18, bit of a gap there, I moved to Canada to do my first job in games, which was to make FIFA and this James Bond game that no one ever heard about. I later moved back to Sweden, where I worked for a company called UDS on games such as Futurama, the game, and Reign of Fire, after which that company basically went bankrupt, and if you played Futurama and Reign of Fire, you probably know why. I actually didn't work in games industry for a while there. There were a few years where I didn't really get a new job, so I tried to do a little bit of modeling, male modeling, but I realized that there had to be more to life than just being really, really, really ridiculously good looking. And so I started working for Avalanche Studios, working on stuff like Just Cause 2, and The Hunter, which was the first game where I was lead game designer. Moving on, I moved to the United Kingdom to work on games such as Kinect Sports, My Coach, and Transformers Universe, before finally going to Germany, right, to work for a French company. So, questions? No? All right, moving on. My current position is that of creative supervisor. I still don't even know what that means. Previous positions include, in reverse order, various game and level design positions, dialogue coordinator position. Basically, that's a nice way of saying that guy who works with Excel all the time. QA positions, and doing all these jobs got me interested in production methodologies and management. Now, why? Well, the thing is, I'm a bit of an auteur games creator. I'm the kind of person who cares a lot about stuff like storyline and all this nerdy stuff, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you could do this or if you could do that. What I noticed was that the realities of making games, I felt they always stifled creativity a little bit. They were always in the way. Because games projects are basically 3 things in one, at least 3 things. You've got yourself a work of art, which is the part that I really cared about. Then you've also got an R&D project, which is like research and development. And then you've got a manufacturing job, and they're all in the same. And I realized that those last 2 were very strong in the context. So I realized that I needed to control all 3 of those to a certain extent in order to make the precious games that I wanted to make. So let's talk a bit about the method. The road has been pretty long from initial idea to method. Every component of the tiered pyramid method has its own backstory and has been revised lots of times. I think even the name has changed. I think the very first name I had for it was The Secret Game Design Techniques of Reasonably Intelligent Middle-Class White People. So that went over so-so, obviously. Some guys in marketing said, Don't call it that. I'm still not done. This kind of stuff is hard, which if anyone in here actually has gone to school and learned something knows that it's really hard with methodologies and stuff. And today I'm obviously presenting you with a bit of a work in progress version, and I'll leave it to you guys to pick and choose, but this is not just stuff that I invented from scratch. This is stuff that I have actually put to use. This is how I work. A bit of background is important. Much of this was developed in a Scrum context, or at least in a context with Scrum terminology. Some concepts have likely been inherited just because that's what was around me, right? Also, this is not meant to be a full-fledged production methodology. I leave that to people with MBAs. That's my boss. This is ultimately more about design than production, but this is design with an eye towards the realities of making games so that you can actually get the stuff through that you want by essentially beating the market to the punch. First of all, before we talk about the successes of the method, we want to talk about failure. So here's an introduction to failure. Why do our game projects fail? Well, my God, that's a long story, and it's probably a presentation in its own. First, let's define what failure means. I use two definitions from my perspective as a designer. Number one is failure type A, which is low level of quality, right? Failure type B is excessive cost. And of course, these can and often do happen in the same project. Failure type A, low level of quality, in a bit more detail. Lower than it should have reasonably been. Okay, think about that for a second. Because an underfunded, understaffed, rushed game that gets mediocre reviews is not a failure to me. That game should probably have been canceled. So if you still make it and it gets so-so reviews, I don't think that's a failure. I think I'd probably pat that team on the back for a job well done. Because I've actually been in that position, incidentally. All things remaining equal, we would have done it totally differently. If someone says this, they are disappointed with the game 99% of the time, right? Anything else, any other way of defining low quality? I'm not going to make this interactive, but just try to keep this in the back of your heads, because if you think of something, you may ask yourselves later, does this stuff that I learned today mitigate this stuff? Could it actually fix this type of quality error? Failure type B, then excessive cost. Actual money costs, this is the obvious stuff, you know. We're talking about everything from the budgets ballooning and becoming really, really big to lost revenue from not making dates. Then you've got brand equity erosion, which is a nifty way of saying that people lose faith in the IP and the brand. So for example, you're making a Spider-Man game and it's a shitty Spider-Man game and no one wants to play Spider-Man games again, right? No, and that's really a cost, especially if you're a publisher who gets their money from making Spider-Man games. Manpower costs, but not the obvious ones that are part of the budget. We're talking about burnout. We're talking about morale issues. We're talking about people leaving, right? Because you're investing in human resources. Well, maybe not so much in this crowd, because I have a feeling that your companies aren't the biggest in the world necessarily, but it's a good thing to keep in mind for when you're successful and hire 1,000 people. Intercompany relation costs, right? So for example, developer being unhappy with the publisher unhappy with developer, you just immediately know that you're working with amateurs if their only way of defining cost is the money you spend. Any other way of defining excessive costs? Again, this is a thinking exercise. So why do projects fail? Well, this is a hard one, and I'm not really sure that anyone's done this with a game design angle, so I'm using, well, whatever you thought of your all right, smiley face or maybe frowny face. I'm going to use an example here from one of my colleagues, Frank. He has slides on production management and stuff, and this is something that comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Their failure definitions may differ, but if you look at what they have there, they have stuff like bad estimates and deadlines. You've got scope changes, the change in the environment, insufficient resources, change in strategy, and there's about as many of those images as what you can find on Google. Right here you got, I think these were IT projects, resistance by employees, which comes back to morale, I guess. You've got your inadequate sponsorship, unrealistic expectations. Here's another one. Other is obviously a very big thing on this one, but then you've got like incomplete requirements, again, lack of resources, some common denominators. In this one, you've got lack of user input for a project challenged factor, incomplete requirements and specifications. There's loads of these kinds of things, and I don't think there's any fast answer to everything, but I've identified some common denominators that I call the usual suspects, right? To explain what I mean by this. 4 common issues have popped up. Every failed project that I've seen as a game designer has had these issues in common, right? Regardless of budget size, team skill or seniority, or the conceptual health of the game. Because the game idea could have been absolutely awesome. Does not matter. Number 1, over-reliance on upfront planning. Attempting and believing it possible to impose order onto chaotic systems instead of rolling with the punches, right? Note, upfront planning and reasonable risk mitigation are good things. I'm not saying anything else. The problem is over-reliance, yeah? You know the saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail? That's absolutely true, but you should also plan for failure. And people generally don't do this a lot. Because why? They have detailed specs, right? Number 2, irreducibly complex components. This means that if something is not 100% done, it doesn't do what it's meant to do. Number 3, poorly managed dependencies. The conceptual or design equivalent of spaghetti code, if you will, right? Anyone know what I mean by spaghetti code? Let's see some hands. Spaghetti code, anyone? Yes, there you go. Don't write spaghetti code. Right. Number 4, incorrect prioritization, working on the wrong things at any given time in the project's life, right? And together I call these the jigsaw puzzle method. You know what a jigsaw puzzle is? When you put together with, right, okay, moving on. Why do I call it the jigsaw puzzle method? But if we kind of look at how some of these projects usually play out, it might make sense, right? So first of all, looking in detail at the over-reliance on upfront planning. First, people do upfront planning and documentation. Then they assume that it's all going to play out exactly like that. We might throw in an arbitrary stuff happens buffer, like, ooh, let's give them, 1/3 more time just in case. But this only accounts for various unknowns, stuff that you're thinking, oh, it might be out there, or, that might not play out. Usually people don't account for false positives. In other words, stuff that you're absolutely sure is going to work and then doesn't. End result then, contingencies prove to be painfully inadequate, so your plan B just doesn't work. Drastic measures have to be taken in order to save the project, like for example, crunch, scope cuts, or delays with scope increases, just for laughs. Raise your hands if this sounds familiar. There you go. Some noobs in this room, you'll get it. Number 2, irreducibly complex components, right? So we work on features and content in parallel. Why wouldn't we? We have detailed specs. Our features are irreducibly complex, so unless they're 100% complete, they cannot be tested, right? Sometimes the testability threshold is lower than 100%, but often it's still arbitrary, right? Everything is designed as if it has to be 100% done. It's just sometimes you're lucky. The end result, feature doesn't work out as intended. Content gets thrown away. It was created to fit the initial spec, but it has to be thrown away or reworked. And then in some cases, the feature itself ends up having to be discarded or reworked. So again, raise your hands if this sounds familiar. Anyone? Yeah, seeing some hands. Cool. Happy. Or not happy. Sad for you. Number 3, poorly managed dependencies. So we don't make a big deal of dependencies because, well, our specs are so detailed, I don't see what could go wrong. That's a quote from Napoleon. That's not really a quote from Napoleon. So for example, we implement guns into the game before the player character is implemented and can shoot them. We won't really know if the guns do what they're supposed to do before later when the player character is in, right? So consequently, no deliverable can truly be verified before its cross-dependent components are verified. When can you verify the guns in this example? Well, whenever the player character is done. But we still check the boxes, thus deluding ourselves. Producers like to tick the boxes. So it's just, oh, it's done. Game's 80% done. No, it's not. End result, right? So the feature may not, or it may work as intended in isolation, but it ends up not fitting in with the rest of the environment. Just as with the irreducible complexity problem, work has to be redone or thrown away, right? Raise your hands if this sounds familiar. Fewer hands this time. Good. Okay, cool. Happy. Then now we come to something that if you guys work with publishers or if you are publishers, this always happens. Okay, so first, issue number 4, incorrect prioritization, right? So we prioritize work in order of risk, which is not really a risk. It just assumes that difficult equals important. The idea that politically driven is important, right? And it can also be influenced by incentives and little quirks on the business end, like, for example, the publisher desire to mitigate risk upfront. The publisher has a very clear for what they want to do with the game, right? And they just say that absolutely everything in the original mandate, in the high-level concept, has to be in. So they just want to mitigate all the stuff that's, you know, risky to them, and why not? But what happens is, as the release date gets closer and closer, they become a lot more pragmatic and start cutting the scope. But you've already done fast and sometimes not so fast prototypes, lots of them, to mitigate features that did not make it into the game. Because, well, first it was crucial, then it wasn't. And I worked on games like this before. I worked on a game that was meant, or it absolutely had to be a kickboxing game. Had to be a kickboxing game. Before, like, 2 or 3 weeks before alpha, then it was perfectly okay for it to just be a boxing game. And luckily, I had only made a boxing game up until this point, because I managed to convince them that whatever happens, we can just put kicks in there later. And they just go, okay, let's just put kicks in there later. I win. Then you have the developer wanting the project to drag on, right? Why? Because most developers have no hope in hell of ever seeing any royalty money, so the only money they'll ever see is milestone payments, right? You know you're doing this. Publishers want flashy graphics and hack demos, sometimes because they're not really that good at developing games themselves, so they want to have the flashy graphics, right? They don't understand anything before it looks pretty. But then you have, you know, the hack demos. That makes a bit more sense, trade shows and stuff, creating buzz, but it's still butt pain. So, yeah, that happens. Then you have developers focus on technical deliverables. Usually the contracts are written in such a way that whatever happens to the actual game, the developer keeps any technology that was developed. So usually the prioritization is a little bit off, and the developer tells the publisher that it's very, very important that we do all this technical stuff. Then the project fails and the developer keeps the technology. So, end result then, loads of work has to be thrown away, like hacks and content that is built on those hacks, massive amounts of friction within the development team, between developers and publishers, with consumers. Raise your hands if this sounds familiar. Thank you. Cool. So, how is this a jigsaw puzzle? Well, we spend loads of time making a detailed spec, which is our left-hand side picture. Detailed spec. This is then subdivided into tasks that are way too large and can only be tested when they're 100% done. Every piece has to be evaluated in context, so they're not worked on in context, so they come out wrong. And then you're working on the wrong things at any given time. But the most important thing is the following. This is what you end up with, right? And the most important point is this. This is a picture that looks very little like the original spec, and it's obviously broken to the end user. It cannot be launched like this, but it might be, right? And then usually what happens? Well, this. That's me trying to draw a little bit. So what should we be doing instead? Well, this is my humble idea. Number one, we should be building a pyramid and not a jigsaw puzzle, right? This is a pyramid. Because even if we only get halfway, you still got a pyramid. Sure, it's a Mexican pyramid, but it's still a pyramid, right? And the player, this is serious, don't laugh. This is serious stuff. The player would never know the difference. Right? With the jigsaw puzzle, they would know. Okay, it's metaphor, right? It's not perfect, but you get what I'm getting at, right? To try to get yourself in a position where if you don't make it all the way to the top, you can still launch. the safest possible way, right? And this is preferable to going at it 3 months before launch. If you actually build it that way from the beginning, it's a lot more fun. And it's definitely a lot more fun than having someone from the publisher come and do it for you, because that's just going to break the whole thing. So let's talk about the method, the tiered pyramid method, right? So for anything to make any sense, we're going to have to talk about the components of the pyramid. And first of all, for these components to make more sense, we should have a game in mind. So let's pretend that we're making a first-person shooter. Everyone knows that. I think you call them an ego shooter here in Germany. Yeah, cool. Usually made by developers with huge egos. I just thought of that. That was pretty funny. Actually, the first game where I developed this method was a first-person game called The Hunter. Anyone play that game? No, I haven't played your games either. Anyway, this was the first game where I developed this. This was a first-person game, but it's not necessarily a first-person shooter as such. It just shares a lot of the mechanics of other first-person shooters, right? So to kind of explain where some of these ideas come from. First of all, the tier pyramid, what is it composed of? Well, we have a bunch of components. The first one is product tiers. The next one is feature tiers, followed by feature subsets, and mechanics. Now, before we go on in any detail, remember, these are just words. You can call them 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't care. Right? These are just the words that I use. Component number 1, product tiers. A product tier is a horizontal slice of a product. It should solve the high-level problem statements of the product, like, for example, simplistic example, move around in first person and kill stuff. Right? It should be as small as it can be, and it should contain every cross-dependent game component. We're going to look at what that means. Product tiers may feature downward dependencies, but upward only compatibilities. You cannot be dependent on something that is higher in the pyramid. For example, if the final product is meant to be an FPS with cover, grenades, and dual wielding, product tier 1 can be a humble, on-foot, first-person shooter. Right? So, for example, just look at this visually. Product tier number 1, right, is just your humble, on-foot FPS with just guns. Product tier 2 adds cover and grenades. Product tier 3 adds dual wielding, which is using one pistol in each hand, right? Like that one guy in that game. Anyway, the final product is basically assembled by stacking these horizontal slices on top of each other. Now, if you look at this, you have product tier 1 and product tier 2 called crucial, as in super duper important. We cannot launch without this. Now, again, people get more pragmatic as the release date comes closer. But for whatever reason, we decided that these two we absolutely have to be able to launch. Product tier 3 is considered non-crucial, right? So anyone have any idea why? This is like one of the few interactive moments. Anyone know why product tier 3 is non-crucial? Yes? This is true, but don't you think that's true for number 2?
Yes, but it seems to be more important for the actual gameplay.
I think you're right from a purely intuitively, you've nailed it. What I would phrase it as is dual wielding solves a problem that you already solved in the game, because you can already shoot stuff in the face. Now you can do it like this. It's the same problem. You're solving it again, right? It's cool. It's nice to have it on the back of the box, but it's not really technically that important, right? No. Number 2, feature tiers. Feature tiers are the cross-dependent components that make up a product tier. Right? They are isolated but fully functional stepping stones towards the final goal of the feature. Example, the feature tier of the feature that we call player mechanics only needs to satisfy the requirements of the first product tier. Now, this was a lot of text at once, so graphics to the rescue. Bam, right? Right? So, for example, product tier 1 needed to be an on-foot first-person shooter with guns, right? For that, we've decided that we need player mechanics, we need environments and objects, weapons and items, opposition and AI, and user interface and menus, right? Most of the components in the final game. Now, this is a simplistic example, but you know what I mean. And you get less and less stuff upwards. You will notice that all the green arrows go either sideways or downwards, because, as I say, you cannot have dependencies upwards. That means you are not allowed to wait for a later feature before verifying a feature, because you're not getting it. You're not going to get it. They say they will not, right? So you see there's one more arrow there that goes upwards and that has a big crossed over thing. Yeah, that's to hit that point home even more. Anyway, moving on. Component 3, feature subsets, right? Feature subsets are the cross-dependent components that make up a feature tier. Example, the components that player mechanics 1 needs in order to satisfy the needs of product tier 1. Let's visualize this again. Player mechanics 1 is composed of movement 1, weapon usage 1, item usage 1, right? These are all things that the player character can do. And then you've got your uncategorized mechanics, which is just my etc. category where I throw a bunch of stuff in that I forgot. To kind of show how these are interdependent, if you're going to have guns in your ego shooter, right, you need to have the actual guns, which you'll find in weapons and items 1, right-hand side. You want to be able to equip your gun, so you need the user interface and menus. And then you want your player mechanics to be able to use the guns. Sure, you don't need all of these, but if you don't have the player mechanics, I really, really hope that your game is about dressing and undressing soldiers. Right? Because otherwise it's not going to do what it's meant to do. Right? That could be a cool game, actually. I think that's pretty good for a phone. Right? Anyway, moving on. Component number 4, mechanics. This is the smallest component. These are the lowest level components, and they make up the feature subsets. You recognize this, we're breaking everything down in smaller and smaller components. For example, right, using WASD, which is your, buttons are your keyboard, to control the positioning of a free flight camera, while using the mouse to control the orientation of that same camera. Now, don't worry about the details here, that's not the big point. This is just the detailed, broken down stuff that goes into something like movement 1. And now we're at the very lowest level, right? So again, to repeat, you've got your product tiers, feature tiers, feature subsets, and mechanics. And again, just words, still, right? Now, how do we build the pyramid? Because obviously I'm Swedish, so I can't really tell you, I can't sell you something without also telling you how to build it. Moving on. Number 1. This is how I would do it, by the way. Don't stare yourselves too blind on the details. High-level design documents. Whatever documentation you need to compose in order to illustrate the ideal, the perfect version of your game. Yeah? Lifetime scope is another way of calling it. What would this game contain if you never stop developing it, from what you know right now, right? So we're talking total blue sky stuff. Write it as if there are no constraints whatsoever. Then you want to compose features from your high-level concept and the backlog, right? So you want to break the high-level design into feature categories like we saw earlier. So we're talking player mechanics, opposition and AI, UI, multiplayer, whatever. And since these are containers for feature subsets, you want to try to keep them reasonably small. That's what I do. And then you want to compose your initial backlog. So you're going to have your top-level user stories. Like, for example, the player can use machine guns, grenades, and dual-wielded pistols. So again, to visualize the whole thing, here's your high-level design documentation, and then it just goes into the backlog. Like, the player can do X1, X2, and X3, and Y1, Y2, and Y3, right? Moving on. You want to set your priorities. This is important. Identify your game's focus, which should be pretty easy at this point. What is the most important part of our game? What does the player do most of the time? Which parts of the game are the other parts dependent on? These 3 questions should make it really, really obvious which components need to be verified first, right? The focus can differ quite a bit between seemingly similar games, right? So for example, if your first-person shooter is about shooting a lot of fast-moving enemies, you want to get that playable first. Simplest possible form, but you want to get that stuff playable first because that's what the player will be doing most of the time. But for my game, the Hunter, shooting was actually secondary. Seemingly the mechanics were kind of the same, but the focus was different because we're approaching animals in a kind of realistic context. So it wasn't about shooting. You'd shoot once every 30 minutes. So the big thing was sneaking up on the animals, right? So obviously, I just put a box with a view cone in the middle of a big meadow, and I just approached this from various angles because we got the sense simulation in. So this big box could hear me and run away, and running away was not really running away. I just got like a red text on my screen that said, "You suck," when I tried to approach it, and it detected me, right? So focus really, really matters, even if your mechanics seem identical in many cases. Now, step 3B. Tear stuff up. Now you got your priorities straight. You want to split up your high-level user stories. For example, shoot stuff / grenades plus cover / dual wielding, not all in all. All in one. You want to repeat this for every feature. And these are now your basic feature tiers, right? So group these features according to priority and cross-dependency into product tiers. And again, graphics to the rescue. There's your backlog, right? And it used to say the player can do X1, X2, and X3. Now you're doing the player can do X1, putting that at the bottom, X2 in the middle, X3 upwards. Pretty straightforward, huh? Right? Now, don't forget about unblocking value. Also, don't trigger the alarm while I'm speaking. It's very rude. Thank you. Right, what were we saying? Unblocking value. What does this mean? Well, how many of my colleagues are enabled to get to work by this component? Consider this aspect even at this early stage. Does dual wielding, for example, enable more people to work than cover plus grenades, for example? This is especially important within a product here, right? Because if you have one product here, everything in that product here is cross-dependent and equally important. So there's no way of looking at the product here and saying, which order do we work on? So this unblocking value is the only thing to go by. How do you get people to work as soon as possible? Because you don't want people just sitting there and getting bored. Step 4, mid-level design documents. To me, this usually represents the nominal launch scope, so what I could launch the game with. What does the realistic launch version of the game looks like, right? Should be as detailed as you can make it at this point, and use this as a basis for your second backlog draft, adding to or removing from the previous one. So looking at this graphically, here's your mid-level design documentation, and backlog says the player can do X1, right? And the mid-level design documentation adds by doing X1A and by doing X1B, kind of like this, right? So you're adding more detail to it. Step 5, revise the backlog and pyramid. So you update your priorities, you revise the pyramid. You might not need to do either of these, but it's definitely a good idea to make sure. Because if you've added details to your design now, the scope for each feature tier has probably changed. So you want to check it. I am super serial. 6, low-level design. Now this is the very lowest level of the design. We're talking about specific parameters and stuff like movement, speeds, and so on. What are we working on next? First, you want to create feature subsets from the feature tiers. So your mid-level user stories are the foundation. Like we saw before, these could be, I don't know, movement 1, weapon usage 1, item usage 1, right? Like this. So from the backlog, we're defining, X1A, that's weapon usage 1. X1B, that's uncategorized mechanic, right? Then you want to derive the lowest level user stories from your feature subsets. So that means movement 1 might require the following. Player can control a disembodied camera with the WASD keys and mouse look. These user stories are the basis for your mechanics. That's your lowest level component. So right here, you've got your subsets, right? And from here, you actually take your lowest level user stories. Now, this actually goes from the pyramid into the backlog. Anyone have any ideas why? It's okay. It's pretty simple. Low-level design is super duper hard and time-consuming and annoying and a pain and detailed. And the more detailed something is, the quicker it's going to break and the quicker it's going to become invalidated. So you want to look at what you'll be working on next in the pyramid before deciding what to design in detail, right? Moving on. You want to define at least two definitions of done for each mechanic. One is the base quality level, which means it's good enough to evaluate, and it's good enough to unblock other mechanics. In other words, you can use this system to test the other ones that depend on it. Next one is release quality, which basically means that the functionality is solid and polished, and that the content is not placeholder and it's also polished. Now, someone who is very, very clever and attentive and has watched us up until this point is probably going, this one is a bit fishy, isn't it? Content is non-placeholder and polished. I thought this was just about functionality and features. It's more about risk mitigation. See, content is much easier to kind of predict. And what I would do when I implement this is to make sure that whenever I validate a feature, I need one of every type of asset that you use for this feature at final quality. Why? Because then the other ones are predictable. The first one you make of any type is always the most expensive. The other one's super simple, right? In a sense, you can look at this whole method as a way of doing pre-production and production in parallel, right? One slightly ahead of the other, right? It's about risk mitigation, basically. So then you write your detailed design specs, only then, not before. And that's dictated by whatever practices you use at your company. I don't know how your detailed design documents look. Different mechanics obviously need different amounts of documentation, and not to mention different types. Some are explained well with slides like this, and then others are spreadsheets. Finally, create a shorthand version of your low-level design for the backlog. Within reason, you need it small and manageable, and you want to consider hyperlinking to the detailed documents, right? So revise your backlog and pyramid if needed, because you should constantly be doing this. So visually, how does this look, right? You've got your backlog, and you've got your mechanic. Player can control a disembodied camera with the WASD keys and mouse look. This, to the right-hand side, is the shorthand version, which has a bit more detailed. It's not a detailed spec, but it has an overview of everything that goes into this. So what you've got is you've got your content summary, which is basically the user story. Then you've got the designer parameters. So what parameters do I get as a designer from implementing this? You've got your asset creation that is enabled. So you see what kind of assets you can make now that you've implemented this thing. You've got your requirements. In this case, it says white room testing environment in metric. That just means put me inside a white box and I'm good. And then you've got your definitions of done. So base level is just everything is in and it works as an unblocking thing, right? So pretty basic. And this is obviously going to create additional documentation. Now you want a constant flow between the backlog, the detailed section of the backlog, which is usually like a notes section for each user story, and the additional documentation, because these are constantly in flux and you want to keep them all updated. One thing you have to promise me, do never, ever, ever do this. That is too much information for your backlog, right? Anyway, let's look at this whole thing. Right? What have we built now? Well, we've put together the IKEA tiered pyramid. So you've got your high-level design, and as you can see, that's the green arrow closest to me, right? You've got your mid-level design that kind of goes all the way to what we think is the okay and acceptable launch scope. And then you got your low-level design, which is the next product here. Now, these last two are going to move. Like the smallest one, obviously, it's going to move, right? And the mid one might actually move too. Usually, it's going to get smaller. But then you've got the high-level design, and if you're making like an online game that is going to have a lifetime after it's been launched, you're going to move even that because you're going to have to, think of new ideas. Some other stuff that I want to mention, you might see that I've added product here 4 there, which is like a bonus thing, and it actually has yellow arrows that go up. That's my way of saying, dude, if you absolutely have to create something in product tier 3 that is dependent on product tier 4, it's okay. I'd rather you didn't, but you're safe, aren't you? Because you've already passed the crucial tiers. If you had to do a feature freeze right now and just make content, you could do it. Now, it's not even easy to think of the kind of content that would have these kinds of upwards dependencies, but I'm just saying, strictly speaking, you could. And one more thing I want to show you real quick. You've got the stars on the right. That's just to remind you that every time you finish one of these tiers after the crucial, to check the game and see if you could make an internal demo, an external demo, or actually have a launch candidate from here. This is really, really good when the publisher comes and says, hey, we need a version for E3. You say, that's cool. here's a tier 2 version. I'll leave us alone, right? Instead of having to put something together. Right? Anyway, I'm going to show you something, because up until this point, I must add, this has all been a theoretical construct. You can't actually work with this, right? You can't actually put this somewhere and just say, okay, work, please implement. It doesn't work that way. So again, this is just a mental model for you guys to work with. So what kind of document would you use for this? Well, you can impose a pyramid-like structure onto your backlog. That's perfectly fine. You can do that. But another way is to actually do something custom. And where I work, we use a PBS. So I've actually kind of I've done a bit of a prototype of something I called a tiered PBS. Now, would you like to see this? Because it's work in progress. So would you like to see? All right, cool. Okay, that's the wrong thing. Over here. Okay, here we go. So, I need to zoom in a little bit, and I don't have a scroll wheel, so bear with me. It's not on the other screen. Thank you, Chris. See, that's quality control. How about now? No? How do I actually pass it on to, because I'm in presentation mode. I see. PowerPoint. No, I know I have to, but I have to also exit presentation mode here. Because, sorry, this is going to be pretty much the last thing I show you guys. How do I push it over? Is it right? There we go. The other right. Cool. And obviously, I cannot actually see it. So I'm going to look in this direction. Windows P? Oh. Okay, do I press enter? No. What do I do? Okay. Do I click? Sorry, technical issues. My apologies. So here we go. Yes, win. So anyway, this is pretty much a visible structure that kind of represents what we saw before, right? So this is going to be a little bit confusing at first, but I think the entire presentation has been. So what you see here is you've got your player mechanics 1 right here, right? So player mechanics 1 is composed of movement 1-1 and movement 1-2, right? At the top, you have your summary, which is the user story. The player has 8-way directional movement, control and camera control. You've got additional details, which is WASD keyboard controls, and you've got 2 speeds, which is walk and run, which is like a toggle. A very shorthand version of what the design actually says. The requirement is like 1-1, environment 1-1. Now here is actually a hyperlink icon. I'm going to show you that in a second. And then you've got movement 1-2, where the player can change stances. And then it says at one point, the walk and run toggle only applies to the standing stance. And it's like, well, what standing stance? I don't understand. Well, with hyperlinks, you can just click it, and it just highlights. Oh, right. In 1-1, we actually implemented the 2 different speeds. So this is actually really nifty. Obviously, you can also link to the external documents. So right here, right, you've got your player mechanics DDD, you've got the fake gameplay footage, whatever you might need, moving downwards. You got weapon usage 1, item usage 1. You got your additional details. Automatically reloaded when empty. So it's not really that bizarre. You got weapons and items 1, and I just want to show you this thing also. Like I said, you cannot have any upwards dependencies, but you should definitely have upwards compatibilities. So for example, it's compatible with the scope add-on, and again, scope, where's that? Click. And that doesn't work. So anyway, that's my presentation. I'm sorry if it felt a little bit rushed. I'm more than happy to take your questions. Do I have time for your questions at all? Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I wouldn't mind taking them, and I'm going to blame the fire alarm for delaying me a little bit. But yeah, so any questions so far? Yes?
How many people are usually working together to use this concept?
Well, I've done this all on my own. For the Hunter, the first game that I made, that was just me. I was the only designer. And that's one of the reasons it actually looked like this, because I needed to keep track of absolutely everything. So this was actually for my sake. One of the first things that I actually, that I've seen, that was a producer thing that helped me. Anyone else? Yeah.
Did it rise from synchronized Scrum teams? So do you work with a couple of teams, like a team for developing the engine core and a team developing all the gameplay stuff and another team for design?
Actually, it didn't, but that's a really good idea. Actually, I like that. Sure. Yeah, I mean, when we first made this, we barely had just one Scrum team. So yeah, it's probably useful for that as well. I mean, one of the things that I didn't have time to go through is I would recommend that you set up your content production in the same way as your feature stuff. and work at it in the same way, so you always have a fallback and you have different levels of quality for each deliverable. So if you're ever waiting on a feature, you can always make more pretty, right? So anyone else? Okay, we're pretty much done. So again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope it didn't get too rushed. And if anyone has any questions, obviously you can always start to work at Blue Byte. Yeah. So one more person. Absolutely not. Well, it's probably on the internet right now because I saw some people taking pictures, but I didn't get all the way through, so you still have to email me. I can just very, very quickly just go me all the way, and this is me. Thank you so much. This is my email address. If you can actually spell my name, you deserve to talk to me. So thank you so much for your time.